A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 14. Lessons. Our time in school was supposed to be equally divided between Japanese and English, but since I had been already carefully drilled in Japanese studies, I was able to put my best efforts on English. My knowledge of that language was very limited. I could read and write a little, but my spoken English was scarcely understandable. I had, however, read a number of translations of English books, and, more valuable than all else, I possessed a supply of scattered knowledge obtained from a little set of books that my father had brought me from the capital when I was only a child. They were translations compiled from various sources and published by one of the progressive book houses of Tokyo. I do not know whose idea it was to translate and publish those 10 little paper volumes, but whoever it was holds my lasting gratitude. They brought the first shafts of light that opened to my eager mind the wonders of the Western world, and from them I was led to countless other friends and companions who, in the years since, have brought me such wealth of knowledge and happiness that I cannot think what life would have been without them. How well I remember the day they came. Father had gone to Tokyo on one of his window towards growing day trips. That was always an important event in our lives, for he brought back with him not only wonderful stories of his journey, but also gifts of strange and beautiful things. Mother had said that he would be home at the close of the day, and I spent the afternoon sitting on the porch step watching the slow lengthening shadows of the garden trees. I had placed my high wooden clogs on a stepping stone just at the edge of the longest shadow, and as the sun crept farther, I moved them from stone to stone, following the sunshine. I think I must have had a vague feeling that I could thus hasten the slanting shadow into the long straight line, which would mean sunset. At last, and before the shadows had quite straightened, I hurriedly snatched up the clogs and clattered across the stones, for I had heard the jinrikisha's man's cry of "Okaeri" outside the gate. I could scarcely bear my joy, and I have a bit of guilt in my heart yet when I recall how crookedly I pushed those clogs into the neat box of shelves in the shoe-off alcove of the vestibule. The next moment, the men, perspiring and laughing, came trotting up to the door where we, servants and all, were gathered, our heads bowed to the floor, all in a quiver of excitement and delight, but of course everybody gravely saying the proper words of greeting. Then, my duty done, I was caught up in my father's arms, and we went to Honourable Grandmother, who was the only one of the household who might wait in her room for the coming of the master of the house. That day was one of the memory stones of my life, for among all the wonderful and beautiful things which were taken from the willow wood box straddled over the shoulders of the servants was the set of books for me. I can see them now, 10 small volumes of tough Japanese paper tied together with a silk cord and marked Tales of the Western Seas. They held extracts from Peter Parley's World History, National Reader, Wilson's Reader, and many short poems and tales from classic authors in English literature. The charm of delight that rare things give came to me during days and weeks, even months and years, from those books. I can recite whole pages of them now. There was a most interesting story of Christopher Columbus. It was not translated literally, but adapted so that the Japanese mind would readily grasp the thought without being buried in a puzzling mass of strange customs. All facts of the wonderful discovery were stated truthfully, but Columbus was pictured as a fisher lad, and somewhere in the story there figured a lacquer bowl and a pair of chopsticks. These books had been my inspiration during all my years of childhood, and when in my study of English at school, my clumsy mind began to grasp the fact that hidden beneath the puzzling words were continuations of stories I knew and of ideas similar to those I had found in the old familiar books that I loved so well, my delight was unbounded. Then I began to read eagerly. I would bend over my desk, hurrying, guessing, skipping whole lines, stumbling along, my dictionary wide open beside me, but I not having time to look, and yet in some marvellous way catching ideas, and I never wearied. The fascination was like that of a moon-gazing party, where, while we watched from the hillside platform, a floating cloud would sail the glorious disk, and we, silent, trembling with excitement, would wait for the glory of the coming moment. In the same way, a half-hidden thought, elusive, tantalizing, would fill me with the breathless hope that the next moment light would come. Another thing about English books was that, as I read, I was constantly discovering shadowy replies to the unanswered questions of my childhood. Oh, English books were a source of deepest joy. I am afraid that I should not have been so persistent or so successful in my English studies could I have readily obtained translations of the books I was so eager to read. Tokyo bookshops at that time were beginning to be flooded with translations of English, French, German, and Russian books, and these generally, if not scientific treatises, were classics translated as a rule by our best scholars, but they were expensive to purchase and difficult for me to obtain in any other way. To read, even stumblingly, in the original, the books in the school library was my only resource, and it became one of my greatest pleasures. Excepting English, of all my studies, history was a favourite, and I liked and understood best the historical books of the Old Testament. The figurative language was something like Japanese. The old heroes had the same virtues and the same weaknesses of our ancient samurai. The patriarchal form of government was like ours, and the family system based upon it pictured so plainly our own homes that the meaning of many question passages was far less puzzling to me than were the explanations of the foreign teachers. In my study of English literature, it seems odd that, of all the treasures that I gathered, the one which has been the most lasting as a vivid picture is that of Tennyson's Dora. Probably this was because of it having been used by a famous Japanese writer as the foundation of a novel called Tanima no Himeyuri, Lily of the Valley. The story of Dora being a tale of the firstborn of an aristocratic family, disinherited because he loved a rustic lass of humble class, and the subsequent tragedy resulting from the difference in training of different social circles, was a tale familiar and understandable to us. It was skillfully handled, the author with wonderful word pictures adapting Western life and thought to Japanese conditions. The Lily of the Valley appeared at just the time when the young mind of Japan, both high and humble, was beginning to seek emancipation from the Stoic philosophy, which for centuries had been the core of our well-bred training, and it touched the heart of the public. The book rushed with a storm of popularity all through the land and was read by all classes, and, which was unusual, by both men and women. It is said that Her Imperial Majesty became so interested in reading it that she sat up all one night while her court ladies, sitting silent in the next room, wearily waited. I think it was my third year in school that a wave of excitement over love stories struck Tokyo. All the schoolgirls were wildly interested. When translations were to be had, We passed them from hand to hand through the school, but mostly we had to struggle along in English, picking out love scenes from the novels and poems in our school library. Enoch Arden was our hero. We were familiar with loyalty and sacrifice on the part of a wife, and understood perfectly why Annie should have so long withstood the advances of Philip, but the unselfishness of the faithful Enoch was so rare as to be much appreciated. The hearts of Japanese girls are no different from those of girls of other countries, but for centuries, especially in samurai homes, we had been strictly trained to regard duty, not feeling, as the standard of relations between man and woman. Thus, our unguided reading sometimes gave us a warped idea on this unknown subject. The impression I received was that love as pictured in Western books was interesting and pleasant, sometimes beautiful in sacrifice, like that of Enoch Arden, but not to be compared in strength, nobility, or loftiness of spirit to the affection of parent for child or the loyalty between lord and vassal. Had my opinion been allowed to remain wordless, it probably would never have caused me annoyance, but it was destined to see the light. We had a very interesting literature society which held an occasional special meeting to which we invited the teachers as guests. With an anxious pride to have a fine entertainment, we frequently planned our program first and afterwards selected the girls for the various tasks. The result was that sometimes the subject chosen was beyond the capacity of the girl to handle. At one time, this rule brought disaster to me, for we never shirked any duty to which we were assigned. On this occasion, I was asked to prepare a 3-page essay in English, having one of the cardinal virtues for a subject. I puzzled over which to select of faith, hope, charity, love, prudence, and patience, but recalling that our Bible teacher frequently quoted, "God is love," I felt that there I had a foundation, and so chose as my topic love. I began with the love of the Divine Father. Then, under the influence of my late reading, I drifted along rather vaguely, I fear, on the effect of love on the lives of celebrated characters in history and poetry. But I did not know how to handle so awkward a subject and reached my limit in both knowledge and vocabulary before the 3 pages were filled. Faithfulness to duty, however, still held firm, and I wrote on, finally concluding with these words: "Love is like a powerful medicine. When properly used, it will prove a pleasant tonic and sometimes may even preserve life. But when misused, it can ruin nations, as seen in the lives of Cleopatra and the beloved Empress of the Emperor Genso of Great China." At the close of my reading, one teacher remarked, "This is almost desecration." It was years before I understood what the criticism meant. For a while, my great interest in English reading filled all my hours of leisure, but there came a time when my heart longed for the dear old stories of Japan, and I wrote to my mother asking her to send me some books from home. Among others, she selected a popular classic called Hakandete, which I especially loved. It is the longest novel ever written in the Japanese language, and our copy, Japanese bound and elaborately illustrated, consisted of 180 volumes. With great effort, Mother succeeded in obtaining a foreign-bound copy in 2 thick volumes. I welcomed these books with joy and was amazed when one of the teachers, seeing them in my bookcase, took them away, saying they were not proper books for me to read. To me, Hakanden, with its wonderful symbolism, was one of the most inspiring books I'd ever read. It was written in the 18th century by Bakin our great philosopher novelist, and so musical is the literature and so lofty the ideals that frequently it has been compared by Japanese of learning to Milton's Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy of Dante. The author was a strong believer in the unusual theory of spiritual transmigration, and his story is based on that belief. The tale is of the daimyo, Satomi, who, with his almost starving retainers, was holding his castle against a besieging army. Knowing that the strength of the enemy lay alone in their able general, he desperately offered everything he possessed, even to his precious daughter, to anyone brave enough to destroy his enemy. Satomi's faithful dog, a handsome wolfhound named Yatsubusa, bounded away, and the next morning appeared before his master, carrying by its long hair the head of Satomi's foe. With their leader gone, the enemy was thrown into confusion, and Satomi's warriors, with a mighty rush, put them to flight. Thus was the province restored to peace and prosperity. Then, so bitterly did Satomi regret his promise that he was enraged at the very sight of the faithful animal to whom he owed his good fortune. But his beautiful daughter, the Princess Fuse, pitied the wronged animal. "The word of a samurai once uttered cannot be recalled," she said. "It is my duty to uphold the honour of my father's word." So the filial daughter went with Yatsubusa to a mountain cave, where she spent her time in praying to the gods that a soul might not be given to the brave animal. And with every murmured prayer, the noble nature of the dumb Yatsubusa drew nearer to the borderline of human intelligence. One day there came to the mountain a loyal retainer of Satomi. He saw just within the cave the Princess Fuse sitting before the shrine holding an open book. Before her, like a faithful vassal, Yatsubusa listened with bowed head to the holy reading. Believing he was doing a noble deed, the retainer lifted his gun and fired. The bullet, swift and strong, was guided by fate. It passed directly through the body of Yatsubusa and on, piercing the heart of the Princess Fuse. At the instant, the freed spirit of the princess, as 8 shining stars and a floating mist, rose from her body and floated softly through the sky to the 8 corners of the world. Each star was a virtue: loyalty, sincerity, filial piety, friendship, charity, righteousness, courtesy, and wisdom. Fate guided each star to a human home, and in its course of time, to each of those homes a son was born. As they blossomed into manhood, fate brought the youths together, and the reunited 8 virtues became heroic vassals, through whom came glory to the name of Satomi. So the spirit of the filial daughter brought honour to her father's name. I could not understand why this miracle story, filled with lofty symbolism, could be more objectionable than the many fables and fairy tales of personified animals that I had read in English literature. But after much pondering, I concluded that thoughts, like the language on one side of the world, are straightforward and literal, and on the other, vague, mystical, and visionary. At the end of my school life, my beloved books were returned to me. I have them now, battered, loose-leafed and worn, and I still love them. As time passed on, I learned to like almost everything about my school, even many of the things which at first I found most trying. But there was one thing from the very first I had enjoyed with my whole heart. The school building was surrounded by large grounds with tall trees. A small lawn near the principal doorway was well cared for, but beyond was an extensive stretch of weedy grass and untrained shrubbery. There were no stone lanterns, no pond with darting goldfish, and no curving bridge. Just big trees with unbound branches, uncut grass, and freedom to grow. At my my home, there was one part of the garden that was supposed to be wild. The trees were twisted like wind-blown mountain pines, the stepping stones marked an irregular path across ground covered with pine needles. The fence was of growing cedar peeping between uneven rods of split bamboo, and the gate was of brushwood tied with rough twine. But someone was always busy trimming the pines or cutting the hedge, and every morning Gia wiped off the stepping stones and, after sweeping beneath the pine trees, carefully scattered fresh pine needles gathered from the forest. There, the wildness was only constant repression, but here at the school, everything was filled with the uplifting freshness of unrestrained freedom. This I enjoyed with a happiness so great that the very fact that such happiness could exist in the human heart was a surprise to me. One section of this wild ground the teachers divided into small gardens, giving one to each of the girls and providing any kind of flower seeds we wanted. This was a new delight. I already loved the free growth of the trees and the grass on which I could walk even in my shoes. But this plant what you please garden gave me a wholly new feeling of personal right. I, with no volition of tradition, no stain on the family name, no shock to a parent, teacher, or townspeople, no harm to anything in the world, was free to act. So instead of having a low bamboo fence around my garden, as most girls had, I went to the kitchen and coaxed the cook to give me some dried branches used for kindling. Then I made a rustic hedge, and in my garden, instead of flowers, I planted potatoes. No one knows the sense of reckless freedom which this absurd act gave me, nor the consequences to which it led. It had unloosed my soul, and I stood listening while, from a strange tangle of unconventional smiles and informal acts, of outspoken words and unhidden thoughts, of growing trees and untouched grass, the spirit of freedom came knocking at my door. Chapter 15. How I Became a Christian. In my Nagaoka home, notwithstanding the love and care that surrounded me, my mind was always filled with unanswered questions. My education as a priestess had developed my mind, but it had grown in cramped silence. For, liberal as my father was in his views regarding my training, I was influenced by the home atmosphere of conservatism and rarely spoke even to him of my innermost thoughts. But occasionally this reserve was broken. Once, just after I had made many bows of farewell to the departing guests of the 300th death celebration of an ancestor, I asked, "Honourable Father, who is the first, the away back, the very beginning of our ancestors?" "Little daughter," Father gravely answered, "that is a presumptuous question for a well-bred girl to ask, but I will be honest and tell you that I do not know. Our great Confucius replied to his disciple concerning that very question, 'We know not life.'" I was very young, but I well understood that I must in the future be more demure and womanly in my inquiries and not ask questions with the freedom of a boy. The influence of my school life in Tokyo had been subtle. Unconsciously, I had expanded until gradually I had become convinced that asking questions was only a part of normal development. Then, for the first time in my life, I attempted to put into words some of the secret thoughts of my heart. This was gently encouraged by my tactful teachers, and as time passed on, I realized more and more that they were wonderfully wise for women, and my confidence in them grew. Not only this, but their effortless influence to inspire happiness changed my entire outlook on life. My childhood had been happy, but it had never known one throb of what may be called joyousness. I used to gaze at the full moon sailing in the deep sky with all the poetic ecstasy of the Japanese heart, but always, like a shadow, came the thought, "It will grow less from tonight." Our flower viewings were a delight to me, but invariably as I travelled homewards I sighed to myself, "The lovely blossoms will fall before the winds of tomorrow." So it was with everything. In the midst of gladness, I unconsciously sent out a heart search for a thread of sadness. I ascribed this morbid tendency to the Buddhist teaching of my childhood, for there is a strain of hopeless sadness in all Buddhist thought. But my life at school blew into my heart a breath of healthful cheerfulness. As the restraint which had held me like a vice began to relax, so there melted within me the tendency to melancholy. It could not be otherwise, for the teachers, whether working, playing, laughing, or even reproving, were a continual surprise. In my home, surprises had been infrequent. People bowed, walked, talked, and smiled exactly as they had bowed, walked, talked, and smiled yesterday, and the day before, and in all past time. But these astonishing teachers were never the same. They changed so unexpectedly in voice and manner with each person to whom they spoke that their very changeableness was a refreshing attraction. They reminded me of cherry blossoms. Japanese people love flowers for what they mean. I was taught from babyhood that the plum, bravely pushing its blossoms through the snows of early spring, is our bridal flower because it is an emblem of duty through hardship. The cherry is beautiful and it never fades, for the lightest breeze scatters the still, fresh and fragrant petals into another beauty of tinted floating clouds, which again changes to a carpet of delicate white and pink shells. Like my teachers, always changing and always beautiful. Although I now know that my first impression of American womanhood were exaggerated, I have never regretted this idolization, for through it I came to realize the tragic truth that the Japanese woman, like the plum blossom, modest, gentle, and bearing unjust hardship without complaint, is often little else than a useless sacrifice, while the American woman, self-respecting, untrammeled, changing with quick adaptability to new conditions, carries inspiration to every heart because her life, like the blossom of the cherry, blooms in freedom and naturalness. This realization was of slow growth, and it brought with it much silent questioning. From childhood, I had known, as did all Japanese people, that woman is greatly inferior to man. This I never questioned. It was fate, but as I grew older, I so constantly saw that fate brings inconvenience and humiliation to blameless people that I fell into a habit of puzzling in a crude, childish way over this great unkind power. At last a day came when my heart broke into open rebellion. Ever since the hard days before the Restoration, my mother had been subject to occasional attacks of asthma, which we all were sincere in believing was due to some unknown wrong committed by her in a previous existence. Once, when, after a breathless struggle, I heard her gasp, "It's fate and must be borne," I ran to Ishi and asked indignantly why fate had made my mother suffer. "It cannot be helped," she replied with pitying tears in her eyes. "It is because of the unworthiness of woman. But you must be calm, Etsubo-sama. The honourable mistress does not complain. She is proud to bear silently." I was too young to understand, but with my heart pounding in hot rebellion against the powerful, mysterious injustice, I pulled myself into Ishi's lap and, convulsingly clinging to her, begged her to tell me a story, quick, of clashing swords and flying arrows and heroes who fought and won. Japanese children were not taught that rebellious thoughts, if unexpressed, are wrong to the gods. So the resentment in my heart grew. But as it grew there, slowly drifting into and curiously blended with it, a blind wonder why my mother and Ishi, when hardship came for which they were not to blame, should submit to it. Not only dutifully and patiently, that, of course, it was their place as women to do, but with pride. Something within me cried out that however dutiful they might be in their act, their hearts ought to rebel. Yet I had known both unnecessarily to accept a humiliating blame that they knew was not theirs. That those two noble women should encourage self-humiliation, I resented more bitterly than I did the hard decrees of fate. Of course, this thought was not clear in my mind at the time. Then, and for years after, my idea of fate, for in fate I firmly believed, was of a vague, floating, stupendous power for which I felt only resentful wonder. Another puzzle came one midsummer airing day. It seems odd that it should have happened there, for airing days were the most carefree, happy time of the year for me. When the go-downs were emptied and long ropes stretched in the sunshine, on which were hung torn banners bearing our crest, old field curtains used in the camps of our ancestors, ancient regalia of house officers, and many odd-shaped garments belonging to what Ishi's fairy tales called the olden time. Beneath the low eaves were piles of clumsy horse armour, bound with faded ropes of twisted silk, and old war wagons, spears, battle axes, bows, and sheaves of arrows stood in out-of-the-way corners of the garden. All available space was utilised. Even the bridge posts and the stone lanterns were decorated with chain silk armour and lacquer helmets with fearful masks. The confusion was delightful. I loved it. And Father would walk around with me, showing me things and explaining their use, until, all perspiring with eyes dazzled by the sun, we would go outdoors and stumble through the cluttered-up halls to Honourable Grandmother's room. That seemed to be the only place in the house in order. Everywhere else were busy servants brushing, folding, or carrying, and at the same time all chattering gaily. For airing days, although bringing hard work, were a happy diversion in our rather monotonous household, and always cordially welcomed by the servants. When Father and I reached Honourable Grandmother's room, we found ourselves suddenly shut away from all the turmoil in a place cool and quiet. I can see Father now. With a sigh of satisfaction, he closed the door behind him and, pushing aside the proffered cushion, bowed his thanks to Honourable Grandmother and seated himself on the cool straw mat beside the open doors overlooking the shady wild garden. There he would sit, fanning himself and talking with Honourable Grandmother of old times. Once, just after the noon meal of hot whale soup and eggplant, which was always served on airing days, Father went directly to his room. I was hurrying after him when I saw Gia and another manservant in their stiff crest dresses crossing the garden from the go-down. They were carrying reverently a white wood chest shaped like a temple box for sacred books. On the front, very large, was our crest, and around it was tied a straw rope with dangling Shinto papers. Many times I had seen that chest in the go-down, standing alone on a white wood platform. It held family heirlooms, some of them centuries old. The men were on their way to a certain room which Mother had prepared, where the chest would be opened in silence and the sacred articles carefully examined by men in ceremonial garments. I sat down listlessly on the edge of the porch, for I knew that Father, dressed in his stately kamishimo garments, would soon go to the room where the heirloom chest had been taken, and I should see him no more that afternoon. On airing days, I generally followed him wherever he went, but across the threshold of that room I should not be allowed to step. I did not wonder why. It had always been so. But as I sat alone on the porch, I began to think, and after a while I hunted up Ishi. "Ishi," I said, "I go everywhere else with Father. Why cannot I be with him in the room where they are airing the sacred things?" "Etsubo-sama," she replied in the most matter-of-fact tone as she shook out the long fringe of an old-fashioned incense bowl. "It is because you were born a daughter to your father instead of a son." I felt that her words were a personal reproach, and with the age-old patient submission of the Japanese woman, I walked slowly towards Honourable Grandmother's room. It was comforting to turn my mind towards my stately, noble grandmother, to whom the entire household, even Father, looked up with reverence. Then suddenly, like a breath of cold wind, came the thought that even my saintly grandmother would not dare touch the sacred things that we use to honour the Shinto gods. She always attended to the Buddhist shrine, but it was Father's duty to care for the white Shinto shrine. During his absence, Jia or another manservant took his place, for no woman was worthy to handle such holy things, and yet the great god of Shinto was a woman, the sun goddess. That night I was bold enough to ask my father if his honourable mother was an unworthy woman like all others. "What do you think, little daughter?" he asked, after a moment's hesitation. "It cannot be," I replied. "You honour her too greatly for it to be true." He smiled and tenderly touched my head with his hand. "Continue to believe so, little daughter," he said gently, "and yet do not forget the stern teachings of your childhood. They form the current of a crystal stream that, as it flows through the ages, keeps Japanese women worthy, like your grandmother." It was not until long afterwards, when the knowledge of later years had broadened my mind, that I comprehended his hidden meaning that a woman may quietly harbour independent thought if she does not allow it to destroy her gentle womanhood. The night that this thought came to me, I wrote in my diary, "Useful sacrifice leads to only a sigh. Self-respect leads to freedom and hope." Beyond the wall on one side of our school was a rough path leading past several small villages, with rice fields and patches of clover scattered between. One day, when a teacher was taking a group of us girls for a walk, we came upon a dry rice field dotted with wild flowers. We were gathering them with a merry chattering and laughter when two village farmers passed by, walking slowly and watching us curiously. "What is the world coming to?" said one, "when workable age young misses waste time wandering about through bushes and wild grass?" "They are grasshoppers trying to climb the mountain," the other replied, "but the sun will scorch them with scorn. There can be only pity for the young man who takes one of those for his bride." The men were rough and ignorant, but they were men, and, though we all laughed, not one of the girls was far enough from the shackles of her mother's day not to feel a shadow of discomfort as we walked homewards. The teacher paused as we came to the moss-covered stone wall of an old shrine and pointed to a nearby cherry tree, young and thrifty, growing out of the hollow of another tree whose fallen trunk was so old and twisted that it looked like a rough-scaled dragon. Beside it was one of the wooden standards so often seen in an artistic or noted spot. On the tablet was inscribed the poem, "The blossoms of today draw strength from the roots of 1,000 years ago." "This tree is like you girls," said the teacher with a smile. "Japan's beautiful old civilization has given its strength to you young women of today. Now it is your duty to grow bravely and give to New Japan, in return, a greater strength and beauty than even the old possessed. Do not forget." We walked on homeward. Just as we reached our gate in the hedge wall, one of the girls who had been rather quiet turned to me. "Nevertheless," she said defiantly, "the grasshoppers are climbing the mountain into the sunlight." As I learned to value womanhood, I realized more and more that my love of freedom and my belief in any right to grow towards it meant more than freedom to act, to talk, to think. Freedom also claimed a spiritual right to grow. I do not know exactly how I became a Christian. It was not a sudden thing. It seems to have been a natural spiritual development, so natural that only a few puzzles stand out clearly as I look back along the path. As I read and thought and felt, my soul reached out into the unknown, and gradually, easily, almost unconsciously, I drifted out of a faith of philosophy, mysticism, and resignation into one of high ideals, freedom, cheerfulness, and hope. Of the wonder and glory of what I consider the greatest faith of the world, I do not speak. Of that many know, and the selfish gain to me is beyond all words of all languages. When I was sent to the mission school, the fact that the teachers were of another religion was not considered at all. They were thought of as only teachers of the language and manners of America. So when I wrote to Mother asking her consent to my becoming a Christian, I know she was greatly surprised, but she was a wise woman. She replied, "My daughter, this is an important thing. I think it would be best for you to wait until vacation, then we can talk of it." So I postponed being baptized, and when vacation came, I went to Nagaoka. The people there knew little of Christianity. The only impression most of them had was that it was a curious belief lacking in ceremony, whose converts were required to trample upon sacred things. There existed, especially among the old, a strong distaste against Jakyo, the evil sect, but it had no vital, forceful bitterness. The people of Nagaoka looked upon the stories of Japan's Christian martyrs as a distant and pitiful thing, but they had none of the shuddering horror felt in some communities of southern Japan, whose memories of the tragedies of 4 centuries ago had reason to live. My mother, who had learned from father to be tolerant of the opinions of others, had no prejudice against the new religion, but she believed that the great duty in life for sons and daughters consisted in a rigid observance of the ritual for ancestor worship and the ceremonies in memory of the dead. When I first reached home, her heart was heavy with dread, but when she learned that my new faith did not require disrespect to ancestors, her relief and gratitude were pathetic, and she readily gave her consent. But, honourable grandmother, my proud, loyal grandmother, it was impossible for her to understand, and I think my becoming a heretic was her lifelong sorrow. Her grief was my heaviest cross. It was hard, too, to visit my relatives and friends. They looked upon me as a curiosity, and my mother was in a continual state of explanation and apology. One aunt closed the door of her shrine and pasted white paper over them so the ancestors might be spared the knowledge of my peculiarity. Another aunt, who invited me out to dinner, served no fish, feeling that since I was so puzzlingly removed from ordinary life, I could not be feasted in the usual way. After discarding one plan for another, she finally concluded it would be both harmless and respectful for her to treat me as a priest. All these things among the friends that I had known from babyhood hurt me. I could bravely have borne persecution, but to be set apart as something strange almost broke my heart. How I longed for my father. He would have understood, but I was alone in the midst of kindly ignorance. Everybody loved me, but they all looked at me in helpless pity. At first I was unhappy, but my 3 months at home changed everything, both for my friends and myself. When I returned to school, I carried with me all the respect and love of the home friends that had always been mine, and which, thank God, I have kept until now. I think I am a true Christian. At least my belief has given me untold comfort and a perfect heart satisfaction, but it has never separated me from my Buddhist friends. They still have respect for this strange belief of mine, for they feel that, although I am loyal to the Christian God, I still keep the utmost reverence for my fathers and respect for the faith that was the highest and holiest thing they knew. End of part 8. If you are enjoying our audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, make a comment, or share this audiobook station with other friends who also enjoy listening. Thank you.